I wanted to sort of give you guys the basic theory behind carbon offsets, why they're being promoted in cap and trade bills today, and then talk specifically about how offsets can support biochar projects and what some of the issues are moving forward in terms of developing a methodology to quantify and qualify biochar projects as offsets, and then conclude just as an introduction to the Climate Trust and how our funding works and how you would make a project proposal to me. So in an effort to simplify things, I wanted to put up a chart of, this is the world's greenhouse gas emissions in 2005. And I did not put this up here for us to go through each source of emissions. I put this up here to say it's really complicated. There's a lot of emissions from a lot of different sources. It's not just a fossil fuel problem, it's also a land use problem, it's also an agriculture problem. And because of that complication, global warming is a really hard thing to regulate. And so the cap and trade bills that we have proposed don't cap every source of emissions that the world is currently emitting. And this is where offsets come in. So that's sort of the first thing, the concept that I want to leave you guys with is there are a lot of different sources of emissions, and for a variety of reasons, it's not possible to regulate all of those emissions. The next simple chart is this is a cost curve for emission reductions in different sectors of the economy. So on the left-hand side, this is the cost per metric ton of CO2 equivalent reduction. And then the right-hand side indicates the size of the potential reduction. And again, I don't want to talk about any individual reductions, but I want to leave you with this concept that it costs a different amount of money to mitigate emissions in different sectors. In some sectors, like energy efficiency, it could even save us as a society to implement these emission reduction projects. And in others, it's relatively expensive to implement emission reductions. So those are sort of the two fundamentals that I think you need to have in mind in order to understand what the purpose is of greenhouse gas offsets. So the first fundamental is that there are a lot of different emission sources and we can't regulate them all. And the second is that it costs a different amount of money in different sectors to implement emission reductions. Now, the basic idea of greenhouse gas offsets is that some entities will be regulated. The sort of most obvious entity to regulate is anyone who generates electricity. That's a big centralized source of greenhouse gas emissions. So the way we're proposing regulating them is setting a cap on their emissions, saying, okay, today you emit 105 tons of CO2. Next year you're only allowed to emit 100. Now that power plant has a few options for reducing its emissions. It can change the fuel it burns. It can cause people to demand less electricity. It could pump some of the carbon it produces into the ground, but really that's only 3 options, and there's a different price associated with all those options. There's also sort of a, back to that original chart, a huge number of other potential emission reduction strategies that are out there, and they might be relatively cheaper than any of those 3 that are available to the power plant. So the idea behind offsets is that you give that regulated entity, whether it's a power plant or someone else with a big boiler, whoever's emissions are capped, you give them the opportunity to go outside of the capped sectors and pay other people to reduce their emissions. So that could be paying developing countries. That's what we're seeing under the Clean Development Mechanism. It can also be paying the sectors in our economy, in the US economy, that won't be capped. So that's likely to be forestry and agriculture, and that's likely to include biochar. So biochar is one example of this amazing sort of mitigation potential that by including offsets in a system, we give regulated entities the flexibility to go out and investigate biochar projects. So with that context, I want to give you a sense of the growth and the amount of money that's going into carbon markets. In 2004, it's estimated to be around $1 billion. This year, they're projecting somewhere around $120 billion. But really, this exponential growth is expected to continue, especially when the US joins the carbon market. There's going to be a lot of money available for offset projects. So we heard a little bit about how legislation is currently talking about favoring domestic offset projects over international offset projects. The way it was written, as far as I understand it, is you're allowed 2 billion tons of offsets a year. They want at least 1 billion of those tons to come from domestic projects. The problem is there are a lot more mitigation opportunities internationally where there aren't necessarily caps than there are in the US. And so because of that, there's gonna be a lot of favoritism for domestic projects. So I think this is a really big opportunity for US biochar projects, in that there's gonna be a huge source of demand for US projects and not necessarily a very big supply. Essentially, what we see developing in the US market in preparation for these caps are projects that destroy methane emissions. So those are anaerobic digesters at dairy farms, also destroying methane at landfills, coal mines, and some wastewater treatment plants. And then you also see the potential for sequestering carbon. That can be through forestry projects, either growing new trees or changing the way we manage trees or preventing trees from being cut down. It can also come from changing the way you manage soils. We hear a lot about no-till agriculture projects. And there's also this potential for biochar. So biochar definitely falls into the sequestration side of the offset market. And there's a whole host of issues specific to sequestration projects that I want to talk about today. What we've seen so far from the international carbon market, the international carbon market is called the Clean Development Mechanism. It lets countries who have agreed to emission targets buy reductions from developing countries like China and India and Brazil to then count towards their own emission reduction targets. And what we've seen in this international market is almost no sequestration projects. The types of projects have been limited to reforestation and afforestation only, essentially growing new trees. You are not allowed